this very special concert. So I'm Arshia Cont. I'm the director of Ircam Forum, which this concert is taking some part from. So I'm very honored to present this pre-concert talk with Philippe Manoury. So the particularity of this concert is that you are going to have great soloists, Hae-Sun Kang and Sumin Lee, but you're going to be completely immersed into live electronics, as you can see with the speakers around you, and there are computer musicians who are going to take part in the interpretation of the pieces, which are all back there, including David Call, Serge, Lemouton, Julien, Aléonard, as you can see in your programs. And the last piece that you're going to hear in this concert is Partita II by Philippe Manoury. Another specialty of this concert is that it's a mixed concert between pieces that were realized in France at Ircam and also pieces that were realized and composed in Korea by Jean-Philippe. The last piece that you're going to hear in this concert is Partita II for violin and live electronics by Philippe Manoury. It's a recent piece that was composed, I think, a year ago, 2 years ago. And so Philippe Manoury is one of the pioneers of electronic music, especially real-time electronic music. And not only he's a great composer, but he's one of the forerunners and main thinkers of many of the tools that you and many other people use around the world, even in different styles of music. So I would like to ask Philippe, what are your today's thoughts and obsessions, let's say, on the state of computer and music and maybe research?
Yeah, my obsession is exactly what I will speak now, because it is the problematic of the time, of the multiplicity of time, or the way to make a sort of harmony between the time of the musicians, the living musicians, and the time of the machine, the time of the computer. And closely, progressively, but we are getting closer and closer, but it's remains a lot of work to do on this field. Because as Arshia said, I began to make researches in the field of computer music around the beginning of the 80s, because I was always attracted by electronic music, even if my background is traditional in the way that I have composed operas, pieces for a symphonic orchestra, for a string quartet or voice. I am not coming back electronic background. I'm coming back from traditional background, but I always had a very great interest in the possibility of electronic music. But in that time, when I was studying in the conservatoire in the 70s, it was very difficult, in fact, to share the two worlds. That means, if you remember, at that time, we know very famous composers, but for example, I'd say you have some composers which worked exclusively in the field of instrumental music, for example. I would say like Lucerne, for example, or even Pierre Boulez, because he had never worked very intensively at that time in the field of computer music. And in the other side, we have composers which was working exclusively in synthetic music, in electronic music, like Pierre Schaeffer or Pierre Henry in France. And I was very impressed by, in fact, the personality of the German composer Karl-Heinz Stockhausen, because he was the first one, in fact, to merge the two worlds, and even in the same piece. But my goals were often, in fact, to try to merge these two worlds and to do musical expressions, to express myself in music, nevertheless, it is for orchestra orchestra of electronic music. And one thing which is very important for me in my conception of electronic music is a way to integrate interpretation. Because I think what is important for me in the music is the interpretation. Of course, a composer writes a score, but the score is different each time a performer will play it. It's never the same, and that depends on the feeling of the performer. That depends on many parameters, which are very complex, in fact, to analyze, and nobody knows exactly why a pianist is doing this type of interpretation this day and another day is very irrational, in fact. But the fact is, the interpretation gives a sort of figure, a sort of authenticity of the music, because the music is performed when you hear it. In fact, it's not prepared. And in fact, my interest in real time, it is that with real time, in fact, the music is not composed when you hear it, but is created when you hear it. That means the computer is producing the music when you listen to it. And what I did frequently, in fact, I tried to find a way for the performer to decide what will be, in fact, the figure of the electronic music. That means, according to the interpretation, the electronic music will have a different kind of figure, different kind of expression. And it is this go-between between, in fact, the live musicians, performer, and the computer, which will cross together and to give something very, for me, important. And one main thing I would like to mention today, because it is, in fact, the sort of the root of these ideas, and in fact, it is, to answer the question, my main preoccupation today is the idea of time, because when we think about time, we have a sort of very, of course, very also irrational idea. What is time? Nobody knows exactly what is time. Because if you ask the time for a philosopher, and the time for physicians, and the time for a mathematician, and the time for the musician, you will collect different kind of answers. But in fact, one thing is important for me is the time is not one time, but is a multiplicity of time. And you can experience that everywhere and every time, in fact. Because, for example, if you are walking and if you are talking in the same times, the timing of your walk and the timing of your brain and of your way to pronounce is not the same. There's different, I would say, tempi, if you want to speak in terms of musical idea. But the time is a sort of, there are different layers of time. And in our body, we have the time of the heartbeat and the time of different things. And of the memory, for example, if you record, for example, your last vacation, let's say you were during 1 month in Paris, and after you can recollect that in 2 seconds, 3 seconds. That means the time would be compressed, and the time also could be expanded, because you can have a very short experience, and you can stretch this experience in your mind and in your memory during maybe hours. So the time is always something which is correspond to some psychological experience or psychological behavior, but in fact the time is something which is very complex, and there are different layers. And in fact, if we think a little bit about that, we can easily say and remark that this superposition of times is something that the music knows since the beginnings. Because the time in music, for example, could be the time of the melody, but the time of the harmony, the time of the rhythm, and we can analyze different layers in any score, or even traditional music, in fact. In fact, we have different evolution of timing in the music. So this idea of multiplicity of time and of different categories of times, when I described before, it is something that the music has experience, in fact, since many, many years. And nowadays, it's appeared that the computer is maybe the ideal tool to do that. The computer could calculate different kind of times in the same times, in fact, because there's different kind of process could be generated from the same machine, but with different kind of things in the memory of the machine. But different timing could be superposed together and could be interaction. And now I will ask you, Arshia, because you are one of the specialists of that, you have written a program called Antescofo, and if you could say something about it.
So I'm also a researcher at Ircam, and just out of coincidence, the piece that you're going to hear uses one of the softwares that was developed at Ircam called Antescofo. So Antescofo was made based on exactly the musical need that Philippe described. Just to give you a second description, imagine two musicians playing together. So what happens is that each musician is having his or her own music score. On stage, they're listening to each other, and they coordinate and synchronize their own actions. And of course, each interpretation is different. Okay? So, musically speaking, it's natural. Computer-wise speaking, it's very, very difficult. Now, the goal of Antescofo is to say that, okay, the second musician, we're going to give it to a computer. The computer has to listen to the other musician, and based on what it has heard, it has to interpret its own actions. And this is what's happening in Partita II, and thanks to Antescofo. And the idea here is not only to perform music, but to be able also to express what is going to be heard. So let's imagine traditional music scores. The very amazing thing in musical notation, at least for researchers like me, is the ability of musicians like Philippe Manoury, Pre-talk, and other composers to write different notions of time at the same time. Okay? So you have these people, they can write music for 100 people and imagine what's going to happen without having an orchestra sitting next to you. Okay? We don't have this expressivity for computers yet, and it's a very important challenge for all fields of computer science research. And interestingly, when we started this project, we realized that there are other people who are interested in the same problem. So for the Antescofo project that was initiated a few years ago and came to maturity thanks to Philippe, for several pieces of Philippe, we realized that other people who are interested in the same problem are people, for example, who work on airplanes. On airplanes, everything happens in real time. Every trajectory of airplane is different, but you want a deterministic behavior, as was imagined in the beginning. You know where you start, you know where you have to end up. The weather is going to be different. There are going to be some errors on some sensors. If there is an error, you don't want to stop on an airplane. In a musical situation, it's the same thing that happens.
Not so dangerous.
It's not as dangerous. The system might fail. But what is important is that let's go back to the human world. If the two musicians playing together, if one of them fails, they're not going to stop the concert, they're going to continue. What is important is the overall musical output. We try to achieve the same thing with the computer these days. And I would say, maybe to conclude, that in the beginning, when I started working on this problem, I would never imagine doing what I'm doing today as a researcher working with Airbus and people in places like Collège de France. The only reason I'm doing this is because there are composers, and this is a message to younger composers, there are composers like Philippe Manoury who don't stop asking questions, and very, very hard questions that engineers like me try to hide. And this is very, very important for the future of research, and I think Antescofo is a very good example of a research initiated in the arts, which is now going to conquer other types types of applications like in aircrafts and also nuclear reactors. If you have questions, ask me afterwards. So maybe we should talk a little bit about...
Yes, and in Partita I use a sort of techniques, I don't want to say theory, but techniques which I call virtual scores. That means it's a sort of programming language or a piece of program which will develop a sort of musical development or musical sequence. For this program works, in fact, it's important that it receives a sort of information, what we call data or parameters. And those parameters mainly are coming from the interpreter. That means I will analyze the interpretation of the score, for example, the tempo, for example, the pitch, for example, the dynamic levels, for example, the velocity, for example, the speedness of a trillia, or the speedness of a figure, or different kind of elements of the interpretation. I will analyze that and in fact transmit the result of this analysis to those programs which will produce the score. That means the score is absolutely not predictable in all his content. There's a lot of things which are unpredictable but which are controlled musically by the performer. And in fact, you can imagine several machines which will work and stop, like a little machine which will work and stop according to the score. That means the computer will follow the score, and at that moment it will turn on a sort of program of machine who will produce, in fact, a sort of, not a sort, but a musical element which are based on what the performer has produced. So it's always this go-between interpreter and computer. And in fact, in that sense, the time is very important because you will hear in Partita II, because Partita is a cycle of pieces I dedicate for different kind of string instrument. Partita I was composed 8 years ago for violin, and Partita II for violin. And the Partita II will have also a sort of extension, because I will write a second version of this partita which will be longer, and later a version with an ensemble. But in that piece you will hear, I think, quite clearly that you have some elements that the computer will repeat. You will hear from a pizzicato, which will be like a metronome. You will hear a tremolo, which will be like another tremolo, metronome. And those, the computer will produce several tempis. It could be until 4. And in fact, those tempis are not produced by the computer, but are produced by the musician, because the musician Hae-Sun Kang, in that case, which was in fact the creator and who premiered the piece, when she played, in fact, his tempo is analyzed by the computer, and after this tempo is produced by the computer. And after that, there are several layers of tempo, and she will, in fact, travel in different, she will play a sequence, and this sequence will travel in different tempi. From time to time, she will follow one tempo and one other tempo. And in fact, those tempos will never be the same, and they will cross together, but like if they were written on something very elastic and not. When she will play, in fact, she will modify the tempo, because she will change between accelerando, rallentando, so she will modify the tempi, and that will modify the music she will perform after that. So there is always a go-between with the violin and the computer. And the quality of the sounds which are produced in that piece, there are very few recorded sounds, very, very few recorded sounds. The most part of the sounds are produced by, it's too long to explain, by synthetic programs which will produce artificial sounds, but basically based off the violin. For example, one sound you will hear, which is like little drops, which will appear in the second part of the piece, is based off what we call the physical analysis analyze modeling. That means it is a modelization of the strings. That means if you have the strings and if you press the bow on the strings very slow and very hard, you will obtain this kind of sounds, but which is quite impossible to obtain humanly, because that you have to maintain a very, very slow, quite near the immobility movement of the bow, and but very regular. And in fact, all the sounds I use, in fact, in that piece, are the sounds which are coming from the violin, even if it is not the violinist when the violin is played, but it's coming from the idea of violinistic sounds. So it's a piece which is around 20 minutes, which has different sections, but I will not say more. I think it's better to hear the music as it is. And maybe there are some questions? Or
maybe I'm going to ask a question that we didn't speak of. So the particularity of this concert is that, of course, we are in Korea, and we have a piece by Jean Bouilly, who used to be your student, if I'm correct. So how do you see the future of live electronic music in Korea, and do you have any message for younger composers?
I just came yesterday, so I didn't have the chance to hear it. I can answer you the question after the concert, yes, for sure. But as I can see, it's very enthusiastic, and one thing I have to say is if you use computer, if you use technology with music, your first thought has to be music. Technology is a tool. But the most important thing is the musical expression, because we are all artists. I am nothing against engineer, nothing against scientist, because of course, but our role in our life, if we want to be composer, is to express artistic ideas and musical ideas. And of course, we have to follow, in fact, the evolution of the computer and the computer science, because that gave me a lot of ideas, and that will continue to give us a lot of ideas. But we have always to transform those ideas into a personal musical expression. What we want to hear, what we want to express in music. And if we have this idea clear, even if we cannot describe it, but if we never lose our musical intuition on the road, if we are always be coherent with our musical intuition, we can do a lot of very interesting things, even if it is instrumental, traditional instruments or computer. But even if you use technology, I think it's important to do not be too enthusiastic with the power of the machine, but to be more enthusiastic with the power of our brain, because it's greater. And in fact, I'm sure that scientists like you will not disagree with me on that case. Definitely not.
And maybe one other question, since Korea is a very important country in the world on recent advances in high tech, as we say. Do you have any? So I'm asking this question because Philippe Manoury is one of the pioneers of live electronic music, and in fact, for those of you who are familiar, the MAX program, which is being taught in every school around the world and used by artists in different styles, was actually a collaboration between you and a mathematician who is Miller Pocket. So yeah, it was not a pure engineering invention, if you will. Do you have any message to pass for younger artists in a high-tech country like Korea? How to approach people like you?
Yeah, I have no very specific advice to give, but what I can say is you know, I remember a phrase that Pierre Boulez told me once. He told me, Paganini never imagined what we will do with the violin now. For example, Paganini will, I say, stupid thing. Stradivarius never imagined what Paganini will do with the violin. in that sense it's more coherent. That means the musicians are always, have always the idea, in fact, to take one instrument which is existing and to do something which has never been done before. And in fact, with technology the same. For example, when I work with Arshia and other people, of course, I took the tools, which is done. But in fact, when we are experimenting things with those tools, we will discover something which was not previous in the tool. So, from time to time, these things is not interesting, and so we don't want to use. But from time to time, we have some surprise which will change the fact of the music, of our music. Because it appears from time to time that the machine proposes, of course, something which was not previous in our brain and not previous in the program, neither. It could be an error from time to time. And I think it is very important, in fact, when you work with people which are working with computer scientists. In fact, it is very important to use, in fact, what the scientists are proposing. But in fact, it is very important, in fact, to let your imagination and your intuition doing what you want. And maybe you will discover something which will modify, in fact, the context, the scientific context. And in fact, you can see, for example, the piano has never changed since the 19th centuries. And we continue, in fact, to compose new pieces for piano. And, but the computer is something different. It's more than a tool. That is more than an instrument, in fact. It is something which could carry also something which are more mental and more conceptual. And in fact, those machines will be as we want those machines are. And in fact, and we are always modifying those machines according to our wishes. So the only thing I can, only advice I can give you is, in fact, let your musical intuition working parallelly with those tools, and I think you will have actually more satisfaction that if you are just doing some things according to what the tool is proposing to you.
And it's true that working with you, in every piece you push the standards higher, which creates jobs and a lot of problems for researchers. So with this, I think it's about time to go to the concert. I would just like to thank CREAMA, Jacques Soulilou from the French Embassy, the Institut Français, and also the Korean Art Council who made this entire event possible. Enjoy the concert. Thank you.